Abortion rights no longer guaranteed as several states across the United States limit access to the medical procedure. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. It was considered a watershed moment in modern American history. Roe versus Wade, a landmark Supreme Court decision in 1973, which legalized abortion. However, last year, that same High Court overturned it, eliminating the constitutional protection for abortion. But individual states are enacting their own laws. Earlier this week, the New York Governor Kathy Hochul signed a law guaranteeing access to abortion medication.
We are sick and tired of judges and lawmakers telling us what to do with our bodies. And if there's one thing that New Yorkers will not do, ever, is stand by when we see wrong being done. Our state has, from the beginning, fought this great fight. Abortion was legal in New York 3 years before the rest of the nation, before Roe v. Wade was decided. And we're going to do everything in our power to stop the backslide while expanding reproductive rights here in our state. And I know that there are states where these battles are going to be waged, which is why I've taken action as governor to make sure that New York remains a sanctuary for anyone seeking reproductive care, that abortion remains safe, accessible, and legal in our state.
Well, to discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Ameshia is a political analyst, Democratic strategist and Truman Project political partner. From Baltimore, we're joined by Stacy Lee. She is a professor of practice at Johns Hopkins University. And from Cleveland, Ohio, Jessie Hill joins us. She is a professor of law at Case Western Reserve University. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Jessie Hill, let's take a brief look at what the situation on abortion is across the country. It's a very mixed picture. According to the Washington Post, 19 states have made abortion illegal. 5 of those having gestational limits. 5 states have blocked abortion bans, and 27 states have made abortion legal, with 20 of those actually having legal protections. And we just had some news in the past few hours. The state legislature in North Carolina pushed through a draft law that would outlaw abortion after 12 weeks, but that's not law yet, and it's far from becoming law because the governor of that state, who is Democrat, says that he will veto it. So we have this patchwork of legislation across the country. Is that sustainable?
I don't think, thank you for having me. I don't think it's sustainable. It really partly just reflects the polarization that we have as a country. But on this issue, specifically, Americans are really not that divided. The majority of the United States is pro-choice. The majority of the United States does not want abortion bans. And I think the real irony here is that the Dobbs decision supposedly gave the right to make abortion policy back to Democratic majorities in the states, and the states are not listening to their majorities.
So as you say, Jessie, that most of the country are pro-choice. So what is driving this then, the fact that there are so many states where abortion is outlawed?
Well, I think one of the main factors is that in many of these states that are controlled by the Republican Party, they are very heavily gerrymandered in their legislatures. And so their legislatures really aren't representative of the people who live in the state. And they have often, Republican supermajorities that can pass really extreme policies that people would not vote for if given the option themselves.
Ameshia, as Jessie points out, it seems that public opinion here, or at least political opinion, is in many states is totally out of sync with public opinion. I mean, there's one survey which showed that 80% of Americans actually are pro-choice. It's a very emotional political issue, and the divisions more or less follow the contours of the two political parties, but it's not simply a case of blue versus red, blue being Democrats, red being Republicans. I mean, if we look at some states like Kansas or Nebraska or even South Carolina, where abortion is still allowed with certain conditions. How do you see this politically?
Overzealous Republicans, overzealous conservatives have been trying to chip away abortion rights since Roe v. Wade, and the Dobbs decision basically gave them air to do exactly what they wanted to do from the beginning. But quite frankly, before the Dobbs decision came down, we had states across this country that already had hyper-vigilant anti-choice laws in place. Many of them included bans past certain weeks. Many of them included having to visit the doctor multiple times, therefore limiting your access to the abortion pill. Purposely. In addition to that, extreme and egregious penalty for doctors who performed abortions, particularly in a hospital setting. So this has been something that Republican states have been chipping away for quite some time, and something that even under the Obama administration, there were over 400 bills that were pushed within conservative state and conservative-leaning state legislatures that were anti-choice. This is something that's been a long time coming, and I think we have to be real about that. We also have to be real about the populations who are going to be the most affected. It's going to be women in poverty. It's going to be women of color. It's going to be women who cannot work through the patchwork of states that may have abortion allowances. Depending on where you are, it may be extremely hard for you to get to those states. The cost of flights, the cost of train, the cost of travel in general, hotel costs, things like that, recovery. In addition, I would probably argue something that's a little bit different from what your previous panelists said, because quite frankly, yes, gerrymandering has changed the composition of certain districts, but there are a lot of white women who will vote in support of anti-choice, who, when given the option in these polls, will say that they support actually having a woman's right to choose. So we're also seeing this dichotomy where some of the very people who would benefit from being women, benefit from having this ability, are some of the same people who are voting in support of elected officials who are chipping away at it every day.
And why is that? Why do we see that difference?
Well, I think part of it is because Republican women have largely been a mixed bag. White women have largely been a mixed bag. The Democratic Party knows this. Many progressives know this. When they say that they are leaning on minority voters and they're leaning on younger voters, it's because they know that this other voting bloc tends to support, at least tacitly in the voting booth, conservative ideology, even if they will say otherwise. Because quite frankly, many of them can afford to travel to have abortions. They can afford to be able to sustain themselves in another state, or their child who is molested, raped, or a victim of abuse or trauma, and they will go to those states. Meanwhile, these same women will vote to annihilate it in the state they actually live in, because quite frankly, they can afford to do otherwise and do.
Right, and I should add that when we talk about the Dobbs decision, that was the United States Supreme Court decision that effectively gave states the ability to rule on abortion. Stacy Lee, great to have you with us. Now, that U.S. Supreme Court decision severely restricted access to abortions, as we can see in many states. But there's also, from what we hear from polling, that there is also support among women, or public support for women's right to choose. And we see that laws vary from state to state. I mean, what kind of impact does this have on public health in general, and of course, women's health in particular?
Oh, it has a dramatic effect on public health, and especially the women who will be disadvantaged by not being able to travel to states. You will have, especially in the Black community, women are already at risk when they go to have a child. This does nothing more to help that. In addition, the people who would try to access abortion services, the poor, the single moms, the people who are working 2 and 3 jobs, if they are required to carry through a pregnancy that they don't want, or then will they have the means to take care of the children? So the public health concerns spill over into infant mortality, increased risk for women, a drain on additional services that have to be, because what's very interesting is the states that have some of the most onerous abortion laws are also leading the fight in cutting back social services for women who have to bear these children. And all of those have public health implications.
Right, Stacy, as you say, increased risks for women. Women in states where abortion is outlawed will, of course, have to travel to states where they can have access to abortion. That will involve traveling, that will involve extra expenses. But what about safety issues?
Safety issues. The number of women who have go to the ED having a miscarriage because of the number of laws that go after not just access to abortion, but providers who give abortions, these women are having to go through incredibly painful procedures until they feel that the woman's life is at stake or the child's life is at stake, or in cases where the pregnancy is not viable and a DNC would be the medically appropriate solution. In certain states, these women are forced to carry the child in times which that increases risk to them and puts them through unnecessary pain because providers are concerned with the potential of criminal ramifications or having their license be put in jeopardy.
Jesse Hill, let's talk about the abortion pill, mifepristone. The United States Supreme Court actually blocked the suspension of this abortion pill. And for now, if we look at some of the figures, it's available in 35 states and Washington, D.C. And that initial ruling banning the pill came from a court in Texas. So where does it stand now?
That's right. So mifepristone is available across the United States. It's available for abortion in all the states where abortion is legal, essentially. So that is the status quo right now. But keep in mind that this case is still ongoing. It's moving on a very quick schedule. Right now, it is in the Court of Appeals, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, working its way through. And then it is likely to end up back before the U.S. Supreme Court very quickly. And we should hear from the Supreme Court again on this issue.
Right. So, Jesse, just to clarify the situation, the pill is available only in states where abortion is legal?
Yes, that's right. It's legally accessible only where abortion is legal. So if abortion is banned, no one in the state can give someone else or mail to someone else the medication legally within that state for the purpose of inducing an abortion. There may be other ways that people can access the medication in those states, but in terms of what the state of the law is, if abortion is banned, then mifepristone is banned too.
Right. And what can you tell us, Jesse, about this decision taken by the Texas court? Because at the heart of its ruling was a 150-year-old law, the Comstock Act, and that prohibits the mailing of contraceptives or drugs that could induce abortion. I mean, can that law still be enforced?
I mean, that's right. It's kind of shocking that we are sitting here talking about a law passed in 1873, which, by the way, is decades before women were even able to vote in this country, and that hasn't been enforced in many decades, and that the folks who are trying to ban abortion nationwide are pointing to that law now and saying, well, now that Roe v. Wade is gone, it comes back into effect. That's one, certainly an important issue in this case. It is one that, among many issues that the court could ultimately decide this case on. But I think it's pretty clear that some of the folks on the anti-abortion side are really doubled down on this Comstock law idea, and that this question is not going away. Eventually, courts are going to have to rule on whether that law really means what it says and whether we can really start enforcing it again now that Roe v. Wade is gone.
Right. Stacy, I want to talk a little bit more about this ruling because this ruling was a challenge to the federal government's ability to approve drugs that are consistent with all the protocols that they go through, as well as the science that's involved in it as well. Here is what the Chief Medical Officer of Planned Parenthood in Great Plains had to say about that. Let's listen. Okay, we don't have that right now, but as I said, the challenge was to the federal government's ability to do that. Is that a case of what, judicial overreach?
Oh, absolutely. And while the issue right now is centered on abortion, an even larger issue comes into play when we look at the credibility or the authority of the FDA. This drug has been on the market. It was approved in 2000, and it completed the rigorous FDA approval process for a drug. It's very interesting that many of the arguments made in this case were not factually correct, that were allowed to originally support the Fifth Circuit's ruling. And it's very important that when we look at the adequacy, the safety, the efficacy of drugs, that it's based on scientific fact, evidence, clinical trials, all of which mifepristone went through. So it's very disheartening that the idea of religion, ideology, political partisanship could undermine the science and the validity and the authority of the FDA.
So, Stacy, when you say that a lot of the arguments that were made in this court hearing were factually incorrect, I mean, did they not abide by or did not examine the conditions or the protocols that were followed that made this drug, that resulted in this drug being approved?
I think that the Trump-appointed judge, in ruling the case, took a very, let's say, questionable approach of reviewing the information that was presented to him. I think there is little argument, if any at all, as to the rigors and the safety of this drug, and for it to be called into question and to have an injunction placed on the availability of it just doesn't make sense.
Ameshia Cross, when this ruling came out, the leader of the Democrats in the United States Senate, Chuck Schumer, he said, and I'm quoting him here, he said, "With this ruling, Republicans are once again showing how wildly out of step they are with the law, and they are making clear, once again, they are making clear the real Republican objective, your body, our choice." So how do Democrats respond to this?
For Republicans who've always argued that there's government overreach, there's too much government control in your everyday lives, they have absolutely no problem with attacking women's uteruses. They have no problem with leading on regulating if, when, and how you have a child. This is an issue that women have the right to make on their own, a choice they have the right to make on their own. I think that for Democrats, there is a hodgepodge, there is a patchwork of states. Anytime the Supreme Court hands something over to the states, it has never been helpful for minorities, and it has never been helpful for poor people in this country. No matter what the law is, whenever the states have control, at the end of the day, those are the two demographics that get hurt the most. And it's frustrating because we knew exactly what would happen. States that are run by conservative leaders, have conservative governors, have strong conservative or all conservative leaning parties, were largely going to be the ones that pushed the most excessive bans, whether it was 6 weeks, whether it was a heartbeat ban, whether it was making it illegal to take someone to an abortion clinic, making sure that they were making it extremely hard for doctors to be able to perform them, so women would be forced to do back alley abortions, and talking about the riskiness of that. Here we are in 2023, where we have more women who are college educated in this country than we've ever had. We have more women in the workforce than we've ever had. We have more women leading households and leading organizations than we've ever had. However, when it comes to our rights to our own body, we're watching those getting stripped away every day. Democrats have to lead out front with what this messaging actually is, what this means for women, what this means for the country, but also fighting against the rhetoric that says that abortion care is not health care, or that abortion care is something that shouldn't be done based on your religious priorities. Because quite frankly, we're also not a theology. We are not run by anybody's one religion. We are a nation of multiple religions, of multiple demographics, and we are a nation where women can decide to make their own choices on when and how many children they want to have, or if they want to have children at all.
And Ameshia, there is another question which is raised by some people, and it's a political question, and that is, why didn't Democrats codify Roe versus Wade, abortion rights, when they had majorities in both houses, as well as a Democrat president in the White House?
Well, I do think that that was a missed opportunity. I also believe that because throughout this nation's histories, particularly post Roe v. Wade, we always had a Supreme Court that knew that the abortion issue was a hot potato, but was never going to push the trigger against Roe. Now, this is a hyper-vigilant, conservative-leaning court, in large part due to the appointees that Trump had when he was in office, that have thrown out precedent when it came to abortion rights and abortion access at the federal level for the Supreme Court. We have never seen this before. Abortion rights have been challenged multiple times in this country, and they have had challenges that hit the Supreme Court before. In neither of those cases has there been a court, regardless of its makeup, that decided that they were going to basically throw this to the states. This is a huge change. This is a huge change, and I don't think Democrats were strategic enough in understanding that this was not yesterday's Supreme Court, this was not 10 years ago Supreme Court, and that this court was hyper vigilant to change things on their head.
Jesse Hill, there is an appeals process underway. In fact, that appeal will be heard later this month in New Orleans. What do you expect to come out of that? I mean, it is a different court, and as we've been hearing, you know, the Texas court could have been acting more ideologically rather than on the basis of law.
Right. Well, this is the court that is hearing the mifepristone case right now that had not completely agreed with the Texas judge, but that had mostly agreed with the Texas judge and had continued imposing significant restrictions on the medication until the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and stopped it from happening. So I don't expect much progress out of this appeals process. We do know that the ruling will remain status quo until the U.S. Supreme Court either decides to hear the case and makes a decision in that case, or until the U.S. Supreme Court says it won't hear that case. So in other words, there's not going to be any change in the availability of the medication until the U.S. Supreme Court makes a decision. But I suspect that whatever comes out of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, it is probably the most conservative appeals court in the country. It is not likely to be much different from what we got out of the Texas judge.
Right, so you don't expect much change there, but what would have to happen for this to go back to the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, as I think I mentioned, it's moving very quickly in the Court of Appeals. So there will be a ruling soon. And at that point, the losing party can go ahead and appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court again. And you know, it takes a while. It takes several months usually for a case to work its way up to that court, for that court to decide whether to hear it, to hear arguments, to issue a decision. So it could still be a while before anything changes, but most likely it's on the fast track right back up to the U.S. Supreme Court.
You're right, Stacy. As I said earlier on, you know, polling shows us that the majority of the American people are for, they're pro-choice. But what is going to be done about public pressure, about lobbying to get this changed?
I think that we have some pretty important elections coming up. And I think that this is really galvanizing people to get out to vote. I think that people are getting behind it. When the Supreme Court dismissed the argument that an abortion is not necessary for women to maintain equality or for autonomy, this is the first time that a fundamental right has ever been taken away. Women now, I have more rights than my daughter has in terms of control over her body. And I do think that we have raised a generation with the number of more women in college, more women buying houses, more women in the workforce. I do think that this will be a galvanizing issue to get people out to the polls and reclaim much of the lost ground that the Supreme Court gave up in overturning Roe v. Wade.
And this is what is so confusing. I mean, surely politicians recognize that they are out of sync with the people who vote.
I don't think that that's surprising. I think that the Republican Party that you hear about, the decisions that they made, whether it be abortion or guns, is fundamentally out of step with what the American people want. As was said before, the majority of Americans are in favor of access to abortions. And the fact that we have states in the double digits that ban abortion, some complete bans, I think that we now have a group of people that are energized enough. For so long, the Republican Party, in many ways, was a one-issue party. Regardless of how they felt on other things, being pro-life was the galvanizing force behind many votes. I think that you're beginning to see some of the awareness of, to preserve women's autonomy, that we are going to really have to focus in on this issue. And you mentioned before, when the Democrats had control of the House and the Senate, why didn't they codify it? What's most interesting is the Supreme Court justices in their confirmation hearing all gave lip service to Roe v. Wade being accurate and that they would not disturb it. So there's been a shadow agenda that's been going on all along. I think now that it's out in the open, that we will see a galvanizing response to reclaiming rights that women had for 50 years.
Ameshia Cross, what are your thoughts on what seems to be this sort of political dissonance here between those who are going to be running for office in 2024 and the people to whom they are going to be appealing for votes?
Quite frankly, Republicans have run on things that don't appeal to the majority of America for quite some time and still won. I mean, they're running anti-CRT bans. They're running against book bans. They are pushing to cut food stamps and supportive services, mental health, yet they're still winning their elections. So I don't think that that is going to be the thing that is going to stop Republicans from winning elections long term, at least at the local level. It does affect national level elected officials. You're not going to maintain Senate leadership. You're not going to be someone who makes it on the Republican ticket to become president of the United States. But at the state level, where these laws are actually taking place every day, their governors, their state House members, their state Senate members are winning their elections and winning re-election. So I think the disconnect is that it is a losing battle to be anti-woman, to be anti-choice at the federal level. At the state level, those victories tend to still be available.
Jesse, just for the sake of those of us who don't understand the nuances and intricacies of the law, what is the difference between, what I was talking about, Congress codifying this, Roe versus Wade, and a Supreme Court decision?
Well, if Congress were to choose to codify Roe v. Wade through passing a law, which it certainly could go ahead and do if the votes were there, although there would be a couple of issues and a couple of reasons why the Supreme Court recognizing a right to abortion is better. So one of the issues is that, a law might never pass in Congress, even if it has a majority, because of the filibuster.
Right.
So, the filibuster could stop that. And then even if Congress did go ahead and pass a federal law that applies all throughout the country, that law will almost certainly be challenged by anti-abortion folks that will make legal arguments saying things like Congress didn't have authority to do this. That'll end up right before the same U.S. Supreme Court that overruled Roe v. Wade. So the loss of Roe and the loss of that federal right was really a big, big deal.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.